Hello everyone. I started to organise the life coaching posts, and I've just had this sort of like putting it off because I wanted to do a slightly different setup for the life coaching. And then when I saw so many people that's already subscribed to the channel, I didn't sort of want to leave it too long before I came on and did a talk about something, because I think it's very important for me to talk about the work that I love to do and why it's so important. So life coaching is something I studied many years ago, and it's about really looking forward. Like, it's about sorting out what you have in terms of blocks in your life and moving forward to have the life you want. So it's very much a forward focused thing. But because I know I work with so many people who have still a lot of underlying issues from their childhood, it was really important for me in the life coaching program to have a look at each person individually. And I guess over the time I've been doing that now for the last several weeks, it has really come to my attention how many people sort of get put on the spiritual path because of their own background. So a lot of people I've been working with have had to sort of, go back and look at their childhood to understand who they are, why they pick the relationships they do, and why sometimes in life it's very difficult to move forward. A lot of people that I have been working with, see themselves as, very giving, very loving, and because of that they've led themselves into very toxic situations with people, some of them for many years. So I thought today, I actually thought how would be really good to do this sort of series of talks. And I thought, there's nothing better than going right back to the beginning. And what I think I might do is I'll give you a little bit of an overview of an inner child program. And that's where a lot of people are starting. Once you sort of understand some of the things around your own inner child issues, problems, traumas, PTSD, once you start to understand some of those things, then you can sort of break them down a little bit for individual people and sort of look at what they're struggling with the most. Now, the thing is, with the inner child work, it really doesn't take that long to do. Once you've decided, once your consciousness sees where the problem is, it's very easy to address the problem. So it's sort of like our minds are clever enough to bring to the surface things we need to deal with, but we get very used to in our day-to-day life dumping them back down again and ignoring some of the things that we really need to work on. So I always start with sort of talking a little bit, when I do a coaching program, talking a little bit about your background so we can sort of understand why you feel like you need coaching, but also to help me sort of see what you need the most and what direction we need to go in. So our problems very often start out when we're young children. We're born to parents sometimes who are, they can be abusive, they can be drug addicts, they can be alcoholics, they can have really, they can have mental health issues. All in all, it doesn't really matter which way we look at it. And some parents appear to be, good parents to the outside world, but don't always raise their children in the healthiest way. Now, I always say to people when we're doing this work, don't blame anybody, but it's okay to see things for what they really are. And being in denial about that is probably not helpful either. I remember the first time I went for some counselling when I was suffering from panic disorder, and the counsellor said to me, something about feeling sorry for my mother because she was only 17 when she had me. So I carried even more guilt than I had before, and it really wasn't helpful. So I say to people now, you need to see it for what it was. We're not blaming anybody. We're not putting any guilt trips on anybody. What we're saying is, some parents just aren't the most nurturing, conscious, healthy people. They often have so many of their own issues and problems that they don't invest in their children the way is the most healthy for the child. So when I studied psychology and when I was training people in community work. I trained people in some of the work around Erickson because I felt that that was a really good example for people to see how children develop. After working with, government departments early in the piece when I was doing youth work, I found that very often when children were removed from homes, we tended to remove the eldest children or the children in their teens because we saw them as being very disturbed and we wanted to help them with their drug problems and whatever else. And then when I sort of went back to that work later on, there'd been a whole change in the way people thought about things because there'd been so much discovery around the development of the child brain. And we know that children's brains develop very, very quickly in the first 2 years of life. So if they don't have consistent parenting, sometimes their issues around trust are not developed in a very healthy way. So if you want to have a look up Erickson and have a look at his child development chart, it's very interesting to see how in the first 2 years of life a child develops things like trust. Now, if you have a child who has an inconsistent parent, so the parent only sometimes when they cry comes when they cry, or maybe is under the influence of alcohol or drugs and doesn't respond to the child all of the time, perhaps only some of the time, what happens is the child gets a very inadequate, I guess, experience of what trust is like. So baby cries, mum comes in, checks baby's nappy, checks that they don't need feeding. Sometimes we'll give them an additional feed, put the soother in, whatever. But a baby knows when they cry, mum comes or somebody comes. If a child has a parent who doesn't do that all the time, their sense of trust becomes a little bit sort of disrupted, and the rest of a child's learning is built on that trust. So we see distortions then right through a child's life, and we see it into adulthood. And the way this sort of develops itself in adulthood is very often people will develop attachment problems or abandonment issues around not having that consistent parenting as a child. It goes a lot deeper than that, but that's sort of where it really starts. So children, right from the beginning, they learn to smile because their parents smile at them. When you're working with people who have drug addictions, very often children, babies, don't learn to smile if their parents aren't smiling at them. And that sort of really astonished me, I guess, when I was working with parents who had their children removed because of their drug addictions, that children don't always learn to smile. And I guess we take it for granted that a child does that naturally, but they don't. So as parents, we have a great responsibility to be able to teach our children everything, to role model everything. And if we are, somewhat in any way, shape or form, not doing what we need to be doing as a parent, we're going to fall short. Now, again, no blame here. Some of us, do the best we can with what we've got, and that's okay. But some parents do really neglect their own children. So what happens in childhood is a child becomes unsure of the love or doesn't attach to a parent in a way that gives them a very secure sense of being loved. So if the parent has a very inconsistent way of loving the child grows up with a very inconsistent way of loving other people. Then in the early years, of course, if you've got parents who may be, for example, abusive, narcissistic, very self-centered, selfish, a child can grow up either with similar traits or actually in a lot of regards, respects, become the opposite. They become people pleasers because they are living in a home where everything is erratic, moods are erratic, there's conflict. So the child becomes very scared of upsetting the parent or putting the parent offside. And when that happens, very often then the child grows up to be a person who avoids conflict, avoids any sort of drama, and the child becomes a very people-serving adult. So with those things, there comes what we call like a codependent behaviour, And out of codependency, people put other people's needs in front of their own because they've been used to doing that with their parents when they've been young. There can also be other issues around that, such as, parents not being, not treating their children respectfully. And as much as, I hear parents say sometimes, my children don't respect me, I wonder, what are you doing that is putting your child in the position where they don't feel they can contribute or can give you back the respect you deserve? And there's a lot more complexity than that. It goes much deeper. But children start to do things like learn, that they're not good enough when parents are abusive. So if a parent's abusive or angry, then a person can grow up thinking that they're not worthy. If you've had, for example, a parent who was alcoholic, then the babies, as I say, don't get consistent parenting. The alcoholic can very often be quite abusive and use, whether it's violence or mental manipulation, snide remarks, comments. The person can grow up believing that those things are real and true, and therefore develop a lot of limiting beliefs or core beliefs about themselves that aren't true. Now, I'm not saying a parent has to be an alcoholic to be like that. A parent can be a very selfish person or a very self-centered person and still develop some of those traits in their children by not being a responsible parent. So if you are, not available to your child, if your love is inconsistent, so you only show it when you want to, if you're used to putting your own children down, using them for your own needs, that can be like parentification, where you're expecting your child to do things that you don't want to do for yourself. Some of those things carry great irresponsibility, and they mess with a child or a young person's sense of self, sense of being loved, sense of being respected, and that child will grow into their adult years feeling that they aren't worthy, that they aren't capable of being loved, or they're not able to be loved because they're somewhat defective from those childhood years. So sometimes with parents, what they do is they make children responsible. They have no boundaries as selfish parents, so they may infiltrate a young person's boundaries by constantly sort of ignoring their needs or trampling over their needs. And I mean, there's a lot of reasons for those, but most of us can remember sort of, times when we were children where our parents just really didn't consider the respect for us. And that meant we grew up believing, that we weren't entitled to have, things to ourselves, our privacy, these boundaries that our parents broke made us feel somewhat vulnerable. So we don't really understand how important it is to have good, healthy boundaries. We don't always understand, how to treat people anymore, because the way we treat people has become so distorted through, constant temper tantrums if we had a narcissistic parent, or a constant disrespect if we have parents who didn't respect us as human beings. And some people do believe that about their children. They believe that they're their chattel, that they are their property. So they treat them as such. They don't treat them with that with that respect. And very often, of course, that gets carried into their own children and then carried into the next generation. And hence that sort of karmic energy of something being relived over and over again. And a lot of people do that. They come and they say, well, I find that I just keep getting into these really difficult relationships with toxic people or narcissistic people who treat me really badly. They may be physically abusive, they may be mentally abusive, but certainly are very spiritually abusive. And because of that, very often, we don't see our own value. Our self-esteems are ripped apart. We end up with very little confidence. And there's just this wake-up call one day where you're just like, how did I get to here? And very often that's all because you didn't see the sort of things you needed to see as a child to build a healthy version of yourself. So if you imagine when a baby's born, it really is, there is an argument, of course, around the nurture-nature thing. You know, some children are born with some certain personality attributes, and some people are considered clean slates. It just depends on the perspective of the, you know, the person who, you know, comes up with the paradigm or looks at the socializing of people, whether we believe that they are completely clean slates when they're born. But basically they're like sponges. The children take in everything you say and do, and sometimes they don't really understand, you know, many years later why they act like they do. And often it's because of those things that have happened in childhood. Now, if you're living with a parent who's very inconsistent, may have a bad temper, may get angry very easily, there may be any sort of domestic violence there, you can become very, you can make yourself basically a very different person to what you were meant to be. So you may become more shy because you're scared of speaking up. You may become less outspoken, and certainly not assertive. Sometimes you can pick up, if you've got an aggressive parent, sometimes you will become aggressive because that looks like a good role model for you. But at the end of the day, all of these things represent love to us as a child. So if you have a parent who is very abusive, even sexually abusive, sometimes we can see that as a way that we are loved, and we can't do anything about it. We live in it. We accept the way things are, and we form our beliefs from those things, and some of those beliefs may be very poor beliefs that we don't deserve any more than we've, you know, got in our lives. So we grow up believing that's all we deserve. And that's very limiting for you as an adult, because it's obviously not a true representation of the world around you. So then we've got to unravel that to get you to understand that actually your parents perhaps didn't raise you in a way that was healthy, or for you to really understand who you truly were. So as adults then, we often become, you know, people pleasers, empaths, codependents, whichever way you want to see it. All of those things mean exactly the same thing. They're no different. Codependency was a term coined many years ago in regards to people enabling people with drugs and alcohol. But actually you can be a codependent or an enabler of others purely through your own behaviours and your own manipulations. So there is a great feeling here that codependency is about, you know, serving others, being a servant to others, putting other people on a pedestal, looking up to them like they're better than you because of all those things you experienced in your childhood, which told you weren't good enough. So you grow up thinking you're not good enough. So you may become very vulnerable to relationships where someone will treat you poorly because you don't know, you think that's love. You think it's love. You think, well, my parents love me that way, so therefore this person beating me around must love me because that's how my parents treated me. So subconsciously, we start to believe that. So we get into sometimes some really tacky relationships. Are we guilt-free? No. We have our own way of living through that stuff. We have learned then as children how to protect ourselves, how to keep ourselves safe in that very unsafe environment. So we do things too. I remember somebody saying not so long ago, I'm an empath, I'm perfect. Well, no, you're not. Sadly, you're not. You are actually probably carrying around some narcissistic fleas that your parents left you with, which means that you probably have certain attributes or things about you that are narcissistic. Somebody else said to me something about, I wonder if I'm a narcissist. Well, no. If you're wondering if you're a narcissist, you're probably not a narcissist, because if you were wondering, a narcissist doesn't think they have anything wrong. Now, I know narcissistic personality disorder has a definition in the DSM, whatever it is now, and people have to meet a certain criteria to be classed as narcissistic personality disorder. What I'm talking about in this video is people who have narcissistic traits. So they consider that they are blameless, they consider that they have authority, they don't have any empathy, and they certainly don't treat others in a respectful or kind way. And we'll go into narcissistic behaviours and dating. I'll do all that further down the track, because I think it's very important for you to understand how sometimes you entrap people too. So we inherit some of the beautiful manipulations from our parents, because that's what we learned to do when we were young to keep ourselves safe. So it was all about survival. But out of that, you know, for a lot of people, there is a constant avoiding of conflict, and that can create some really deep trauma for children. And a lot of people grow up with complex PTSD, where the fear and the terror of every day facing you know, angry people who are going to constantly be being on your case. You know, you never get things right, you're always told you're not good enough. And if you go through that day after day, year after year as a child, you can develop a complex form of PTSD, in which case then you probably need to go through some counselling to understand that. But that manifests into adulthood as well. And for some people, they can from that, you know, have irrational fears of not just things, but of people. So there's a lot more complexity and a lot more depth to that as well. So when we're talking about, you know, being a child in a household where it wasn't, you know, a safe place for us to be, we can often, as I said to you, you know, develop certain behaviours or certain ways of doing things that help us escape the pain. Some of us may, you know, be scared to cry, for example. So I don't know how many of you had, you know, the parent that said, you know, you're a crybaby, stop crying, I'll come and give you something to cry about. And you had that sort of pretty much knocked out of you then, until it got to the point where you're really quite scared of crying. Another one is anger, where, you know, you get angry when someone's treating you really poorly, and you may look for ways to take out your anger on other people rather than have it at home. So you may become a bully at school because of that. But very often the anger gets dumped down in your body and is ignored, and it becomes a feared feeling because someone's told you being angry isn't a good thing, where being angry is an acceptable emotion. But then what happens is we start to carry around guilt and shame because we have these emotions that we're told are bad, and we can't express ourselves because we're terrified of speaking up for ourselves. So we're carrying all of that baggage around inside of us. And what happens is it sort of sits inside until we have triggers going off when we get older. And that sort of is how we see people who are passive aggressive, you know, who don't know how to speak up for themselves, but explode sometimes. And we wonder where that came from, where that massive attack came from. So there's a lot of issues around suppressed or oppressed emotions, oppressed feelings, low self-esteems, low opinions of oneself. And in all of that, the biggest thing of all is the fact that fear becomes a real problem. So we're scared of people. We never feel that we can speak up for ourselves. And that, of course, leads to further problems down the track, because then when you're that vulnerable, you become prey to predators, basically. So you can be, you know, have more sexual abuse in your life. You can be treated really badly, beaten up, bullied, especially bullied into adulthood. You will find you will get bullied because of those underlying fears and your inability to stand up for yourself. So what happens is you grow up to be a very, very different person to the one that you were born and set out to be. So, you know, if you're always told when you're young that you're too noisy, too loud, too boisterous, too silly at your age, don't cry, behave, how old are you, you know, and you're hearing those things, you know, all through your life, you tend to dampen down those attributes or those beautiful gifts that you have, because you become very scared about showing them to anybody else. So this gives rise to the idea of wearing masks. So what we tend to do is we tend to be a certain type of person because we are so ashamed and so guilty of who we are from our pasts, that we pretend to be somebody we're not. And we learn to manipulate that. So if we know somebody wants a particular type of person and we are scared of challenging that and we want to be with the person so badly, we may adapt, morph, chameleon-like, take form or shape to show somebody that we can be the person they need us to be. And that is exactly the same for a narcissist. So two people can end up in a very toxic relationship because both of them aren't being true to who they are, which is how we often see people later in life, and learning once they become very resentful and angry that they've fallen in love with someone who never existed. So when I'm doing inner child work, I like to go back to the beginning, and I like to talk to you about, you know, how you were parented. And I've got to say the majority of people I work with have had very, very different upbringings, but consistencies. So there are, you know, some parents who just didn't want to have children. There are some parents who were forced into marriage. There are some parents who really don't like their children. And I remember a friend of mine saying to me once, a mother always loves their child. And I was like, well, you don't really understand. No, some mothers do not love their children. And especially if they have narcissistic traits, and especially as that child is growing into a beautiful young woman, there will be a lot of jealousy, a lot of envy, because that parent will feel that they've fallen short of that in their own childhood. So they get very jealous. There's a lot of jealousy there. So I like to find out what sort of childhood you've had, and we don't have to go into great detail, but it's really valuable for us to both understand that some of those things you experienced in childhood may not have been your fault, but you can put them right now. So if you've had a parent, for example, who was an alcoholic or a drug addict, and you'd had consistent parenting, I'm just thinking, like, you know, when I think of some of the things that I could share with you that would make you sort of see that, I didn't realise it was my stepfather at the time, but I had a father figure who didn't want to see the children around when he came home from work. He was a big womanizer. I remember as a child being taken on dates with his dates. And I didn't really understand it, really, because we got to do great stuff. So I didn't really, as a small child, I really didn't mind that, because we got to go to the park, we got to do things. But when he came home from work, he didn't want to have the children around. So we got pretty much put to bed. And sometimes during the daytime too, we would get locked away in the bedroom, not able to come out until things had settled down. So, you know, when you look at things like that and how people treat their children, you understand that there are great issues around attachment and abandonment, and those are the sort of issues that plague you as an adult, because you tend to, you can become a love or a sex addict because of that. And that's another subject we'll talk about later, because I think that we sort of have a very negative view of people who have love or sex addictions. But actually there's very good reason for that, and that is about not being loved in a healthy way when you were a child. So there is sort of a lot to do with inner child work. So I like to have that chat with people, help them to understand the sort of childhood they had. And we very often do some inner child meditations. So, and that will help you bring up some of the things that perhaps you had in childhood that you may have forgotten. It helps you work on some of those things that come to the surface to understand them a little bit more. But the most important thing is it gives you the opportunity to go back and love that child within you that didn't get the love they deserved as a child. No child deserves not to be loved. No child deserves to have a poor upbringing. And unfortunately, there are lots of children that do. And as I said at the very beginning, there are people who say to me, oh, well, you know, they only learned from their own parents. It wasn't, you know, they did the best they could. Well, you know what? At the end of the day, it's okay to understand they were not good parents. Whatever reasons they had behind that, still don't take away the responsibility of a parent to love their child. But at the end of the day, the damage has already been done to many people. So it's a bit late to sort of go back and and tried to change what happened in the childhood. But what I want to say to you, we have every opportunity of changing that in our adulthood. So going back to the inner child is really important. I will talk more on this as we're going along. I only wanted to sort of give you a bit of an overview today. And I'll be breaking down some of those subjects to talk about them more in detail, especially things like the attachment, abandonment, trauma, CPTSD, and how to work with your inner child. Even if you're not doing coaching with me, I would like to help you do some of that work yourself. It can be a little confronting because often you bring up memories that you'd forgotten about, but it's really about understanding your emotions. So we'll talk about triggers, what triggers you, how to work with your emotions, and how to go back and love yourself again so you can move into a healthy relationship. So I'll leave you with that today. I think it's fabulous if you decide to ask questions and put the questions underneath. I go through all of the entries, so if you've got something to ask you would like to have more on, please feel free to do that. Currently in the coaching program, I've just taken on the next 3 people. So I will be offering the coaching program each probably fortnight to 3 weeks as people move out of the program. Some people choose to do the 6 sessions with me and feel fabulous, and that's enough for them. And others want to carry on still doing the work because they feel that they've achieved a lot. Every person is different. You're all different, and you all have, very, very different experiences as children, and it's made you very different people as adults. But don't forget, you can always, always work on what happened a long time ago and still become a better person through having knowledge about why that happened. Having your mind open to those possibilities has you in a place where you realize that you're not broken, you're not in any way, shape or form unfixable, and you can love and you can have healthy relationships, but you've just got to go right back to the beginning and work through some of those issues. And there is work with the life coaching program. So I do give people resources to work through, meditations. I have a few very people I watch on YouTube. But the one thing I want to let you know more than anything, which I think is, really important for you to know, is that I'm not to the point where I feel 100% confident that I am a perfect person. I don't know that any one of us is, but I still work on myself. So there are still things about myself that perhaps I don't do in a way that's, really healthy for myself. We all have certain sort of issues and problems, I guess, but at the end of the day, when things surface now, I address them, I don't dump them down. I remember when I started to feel anger, and I used to say to people, I'm not an angry person, but that was not true. I got angry like everybody else, but I was so ashamed of the anger, I would dump it down and ignore it. And when it came to the surface, I would make sure I would get so anxious. I would have the worst anxiety because the feeling of anger for me was so scary. I was so scared of it. So I'd become very anxious of it. So I know that there's still work for people to do, but at least I can help you on the journey and point you in the right directions. And if it's things that I'm not experienced in, or that you need more professional help, or that we need to have, because I have a lot of people who help me with people on this journey that I can refer you to, then I will do that. So if you need medical intervention, for example, I certainly wouldn't be trying to do things with you. I would be moving you on to the next person. So if that's what it needs, that's what it is. So I'm going to leave you with that. I will come back very soon and do another talk. I'll just pull one of those things out and we'll pull it apart. If you have any questions, do write them underneath, and I will try my best to answer those each time before we do the next subject. But that's the first subject. Thanks, everyone.